October 26, 1440. The sun had barely risen over the town of Nantes when a strange silence swept through the gathered crowd. Thousands stood still on the Ile de la Cité, eyes fixed on the gallows at the center of the square. They weren't here to witness the execution of a petty thief or even a rebellious noble. They had come to see the downfall of a man once celebrated as a national hero. A tall, proud figure emerged, his hands bound, but his posture unshaken. He walked steadily toward the scaffold. This was Gilles de Rais, Baron of Rais, Marshal of France and former comrade in arms to none other than Joan of Arc. Within moments the rope would be placed around his neck. But who was this man really? Was he the monstrous villain history remembers, or the target of a ruthless conspiracy? To understand the shocking fall of Gilles de Rais, one has to travel back to the early 1400s, when France was a kingdom in ruins. The 100 Years' War with England had drained the nation's resources, shattered its nobility, and left entire regions burned and broken. Into this chaos, in September of 1405, Gilles was born at the Château de Chantilly. He was a child marked from the beginning by power and tragedy. His father, Guy de Laval, died in a freak accident when Gilles was just 11. His mother, Marie de Craon, passed away shortly after. Orphaned at a young age, Gilles was placed under the control of his grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man known for his ruthlessness and relentless ambition. Jean had no interest in raising a grieving boy. He saw Gilles as a tool, a way to expand the family's reach and wealth. By the time Gilles was a teenager, Jean had arranged a marriage between him and Catherine de Thouars, heiress to vast estates across Brittany and Poitou. The union brought Gilles immense wealth, 15 fortified castles, thousands of acres, and revenues that rivaled those of royalty. At just 16, he became one of the most powerful lords in France. But wealth came with expectations. The English were pushing deep into French territory, and nobility were expected to fight. In 1427, with France on the brink of collapse and Charles VII ruling over a fractured kingdom, a miracle walked into court. A teenage peasant girl claiming divine visions of saving France. Joan of Arc inspired immediate skepticism, but not from Gilles. He became one of her earliest and most loyal supporters, offering his soldiers, his funds, and eventually his sword. Together, they fought at the Siege of Orleans, at Jargeau, and in campaign after campaign to liberate French cities from English control. Gilles distinguished himself in every battle. His bravery and tactical skill earned him the title of Marshal of France at just 25, an extraordinary honor for someone so young. But glory is fleeting. In May 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English. Gilles could do nothing, as his closest comrade was put on trial for heresy. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in Rouen. Her death was more than a tragedy. It marked a turning point in Gilles' life. The man who had once stood alongside France's most inspiring leader began to unravel. After Joan's execution, Gilles retreated from the battlefield and returned to his estates in Brittany. Those who had once seen him as a lion of war now watched him disappear behind castle walls. Consumed by grief, guilt, and perhaps a spiritual crisis, he began spending with reckless abandon. He funded an enormous theatrical troupe to over 200 people to perform elaborate religious plays glorifying Joan's life and sacrifice. He constructed a lavish private chapel and maintained a choir of boys, all housed and dressed at his expense. The costs were staggering. Even his enormous fortune couldn't keep up. Within a few years, Gilles found himself selling off land, castles, and family treasures to pay debts. His relatives intervened, attempting to preserve what was left of the family's holdings. But Gilles refused to stop. His solution wasn't restraint, it was alchemy. That was when he crossed paths with Francesco Prelati, a young Florentine who claimed to be a magician with access to ancient knowledge. Prelati offered what Gilles desperately wanted, the promise of turning base metals into gold. But alchemy, at least the kind Prelati offered, came at a spiritual cost. According to him, Demons demanded offerings in exchange for their secrets. Gilles, once a respected soldier of Christendom, descended into the occult. In his remote castles he held secret ceremonies, dark rituals meant to summon infernal beings and restore his wealth. It was the beginning of his final descent. Between 1432 and 1440, a disturbing pattern began to emerge across the lands controlled by Gilles de Rais. In villages surrounding his estates, children, mostly boys between the ages of 7 and 16, started to vanish. Families reported the disappearances, but the investigations went nowhere. After all, who would dare challenge a Marshal of France? Gilles still carried the weight of his past glory, and despite the whispers growing louder, no one in power moved against him. But those whispers spoke of horrifying things, screams in the night, coming from castle cellars, strange figures entering through back gates, rumors of black masses and satanic rites performed in secret. And then Gilles made a critical mistake, one that gave his enemies the excuse they needed. In May of 1440, he abducted a cleric named Joan of Arc during a dispute over land and church property. This wasn't a petty crime. It was an open challenge to the authority of the church, and it gave Duke John V of Brittany the perfect pretexts to act. The Duke, who had long eyed Gilles' estates and influence, ordered a formal investigation. What followed shocked even those who had suspected the worst. In September of that year, ducal officers raided Gilles' main residence, the Château de Machecoul. Beneath the castle, in the cellars and hidden chambers, they found what one chronicler described as a place of nightmares. Human remains, bones, ashes, partial skeletons were uncovered alongside clothing, jewelry, and personal items that had once belonged to the missing children. The horror wasn't vague anymore. It was real. The Marshal of France was arrested and brought to the city of Nantes for trial. Along with him, several associates and servants were detained, including Etienne Corriot and Henri de Brienne, both of whom were subjected to brutal interrogation. What emerged from the testimonies, many extracted under torture, was staggering. Witnesses described how the children had been lured into Gilles' castles with promises of work, food, or singing lessons. Once inside, they were locked away, tortured, and ultimately killed in ritualistic fashion. Some accounts even claimed that Gilles took part directly in the torment, deriving sadistic pleasure from the suffering of his victims. The testimonies included graphic details of black magic, necromancy, and desperate attempts to summon demons in exchange for wealth and power. At first, Gilles denied everything. He insisted the accusations were politically motivated, a scheme by the Duke of Brittany and corrupt church officials to rob him of his lands. He cited his noble title and past service, arguing that only the king himself had the authority to judge him. But as the trial progressed and the pressure mounted, Gilles began to crack. Faced with the threat of excommunication, a fate worse than death in medieval society, he relented. On October 21, 1440, Gilles de Rais confessed publicly and in detail. He admitted to the murders, describing the methods and even expressing a twisted pride in the black rituals he had performed. His words sent a shockwave across Europe. Here was a knight of Christendom, once a national hero, admitting to crimes that sounded more like legend than reality. His confession marked one of the most gruesome moments in medieval legal history, not just for its content, but for what it revealed about how far a man could fall. 5 days later, on October 26th, the people of Nantes gathered once again, this time to watch the man who had once fought beside Joan of Arc meet his end. Gilles stood on the gallows before the crowd, no longer a nobleman or warrior, but a symbol of corruption, horror, and betrayal. Before the rope was tightened, he addressed the spectators. He asked for forgiveness from the families of his victims. He warned others, especially nobles, against the pursuit of dark knowledge. And in his final breath, he offered a prayer, pleading for God's mercy. With one swift motion, the executioner ended the life of Gilles de Rais. But his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a debate that continues to this day. Even as the flames of his pyre cooled and the crowd in Nantes dispersed, questions lingered about the true nature of Gilles de Rais' crimes. Was he really the monster described in court? Or had his fall been engineered by those who stood to gain from it? While his confession seemed clear-cut, the circumstances surrounding the trial have long cast shadows on its legitimacy. The Duke of Brittany, a political rival, gained full control over Gilles' vast estates following his execution. The Church, too, had its interests served. In a time when land was power, removing a wealthy, unstable noble from the playing field wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. Critics of the trial point out that Gilles' accomplices were brutally tortured before confessing. Interrogations of the time often involved physical torment so severe that victims would say anything to end the pain. Under such circumstances, the value of any testimony becomes murky. Furthermore, some historians argue that many of the charges were inflated or even fabricated. The number of victims, sometimes cited as dozens, other times as hundreds, varied wildly depending on the source. And while remains were found at Mackpool, modern forensic standards would demand far more concrete evidence to draw conclusions. Still, there's a darker side to the story that supports his guilt. Gilles de Rais had suffered through a traumatic childhood, was shaped by a violent world, and experienced profound emotional collapse after Joan of Arc's execution. His descent into occultism, his erratic financial behavior, and his known association with alchemists and con artists point to a man losing his grip on reality. When seen through the lens of modern psychology, his behavior fits the profile of someone struggling with deep trauma, unchecked power, and a desperate desire to regain control of his collapsing world. If guilt is determined by plausibility, then the evidence certainly doesn't exonerate him. Over time, Gilles de Rais' image began to blur, tangled in legend and folklore. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of this confusion is the tale of Bluebeard. Charles Perrault, writing in the late 1600s, borrowed heavily from Gilles' life when crafting the story of a wealthy nobleman who lured women to their deaths in a hidden chamber. Though the Bluebeard of fairy tales is fictional, the inspiration behind him was chillingly real. This blend of truth and myth has only made Gilles' story harder to untangle. Was he a misunderstood noble destroyed by political enemies, or a depraved killer whose crimes were so horrifying they became the stuff of legend? Modern scholarship continues to examine the case, but no definitive consensus has emerged. Some researchers have combed through old court records, noting inconsistencies in witness testimony, gaps in the timeline, and the lack of physical evidence that would be considered damning by today's standards. Others emphasize that even in an age of superstition and paranoia, the level of detail in the confessions, both Gilles' and those of his servants, suggests a level of guilt that can't be explained away by torture or politics alone. In truth, the story of Gilles de Rais exists in the uncomfortable space between medieval justice and modern skepticism. What remains undeniable is the drama of his fall, from one of the most celebrated warriors in France to an executed criminal accused of the unthinkable. Gilles' transformation stands as one of the most disturbing in history. His life illustrates the fragility of reputation, the corrosive nature of power, and the dangerous places grief and desperation can lead a person when left unchecked. Whether you see him as a cautionary tale about ambition or a victim of circumstance, his story forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature. More than 500 years after his execution, Gilles de Rais still casts a long shadow. His name evokes horror and fascination in equal measure, and the mystery of who he really was continues to spark debate. Was he a hero turned monster, or a scapegoat sacrificed to the shifting politics of a fractured kingdom? We may never have all the answers, but in the end, the legacy of Gilles de Rais endures, not just in history books or courtroom records, but in the uncomfortable questions his story forces us to ask about justice, truth, and the terrifying potential that can lie beneath even the most noble of appearances.